Aloha aneko mamai. Welcome to the 23rd Advanced Maui Optical Space Surveillance and Technologies Conference, presented by Maui Economic Development Board. Please welcome Brian Weeden to the stage.
Good morning, everyone. Aloha. Welcome to day 3 of the AMOS conference. Happy Friday. My name is Dr. Brian Weeden. I'm the Director of Program Planning for Secure World Foundation, and it's my pleasure to introduce this morning's keynote speaker. Richard DalBello currently serves as Director of the Office of Space Commerce, where he's responsible for managing the department's efforts to establish a space traffic control system to ensure safe space operations for commercial and international civil space ventures. In addition, Rich is responsible for the regulation of U.S. commercial remote sensing industry and for general advocacy across the U.S. government for commercial space industry interests. Rich has more than 30 years experience in both the space industry and government, including as Vice President of Business Development and Government Affairs for both Virgin Galactic and Intelsat General, and stints in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy in both, I believe, the 1990s and the 2010s. So he went back twice. Notably, Rich was one of the main instigators behind the creation of the Space Data Association, which brought satellite operators together to share data to help avoid collisions and mitigate RF interference. Rich has agreed to take questions at the end of his prepared remarks, and once again, we'll be using the conference app to ask those, so please get it pulled up and start thinking about what you want to ask Rich after his remarks. So, Rich, over to you.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here today. Before we get started, I'd just like to take a minute and acknowledge the tremendous suffering of the people of Florida. I understand Hurricane Ian has worked its way through Florida and is about to hit South Carolina. So, you know, we at NOAA take this pretty seriously. We have the Hurricane Warning Center, of course, and all of NOAA's assets, from satellites to the hurricane hunters, to the tide gauges, to our amazing suite of forecasters, work together seamlessly to try to provide this life-saving information to the public, to emergency managers, and to other decision makers. And as I reflect upon that work that the hurricane folks at NOAA are doing, I actually think about what we're doing here and the complexity of the job that we've taken on, trying to keep space safe, trying to keep disaster from happening in space. And it takes all of our wits, all of our technology, and a global effort to do that. And I think, kind of ruins the mood, doesn't it? I think that if we have a bad day, it's going to be awfully hard to clean up, as you all know. So I just want to congratulate all of you. It's an amazing conference and an amazing group of technologies and companies that are gathered here. You know, it's been a while since I've been back here. I think it's been over 10 years since I've been back to the AMOS conference. When I was here 10 years ago, I was on this stage, and I think I was at Intelsat at that time, and we were fighting, it was a polite word, we were fighting about whether the government owed any responsibility to commercial operators in space. And this was all before we've all collectively agreed that space is congested and contested, and so it's a lot of water has been under the bridge since then. But I look back upon those initial disagreements, which was the genesis of the Space Data Association at the time. We were trying to say, how do we fly more safely? How do we talk to each other? How do we exchange information? And many of the things we're still struggling with today. One of the things that we do, of course, at the Department of Commerce through our group at NIST is focus on the issue of standards, which is fundamental to everything we do, because if we can't talk to each other, we absolutely can't communicate, and we can't protect our assets. So it's funny to see the dialogue turn. So, you know, after many years, we now have a situation where Really with multiple administrations and bipartisan support of Congress, the decision was made that SSA is important enough that commercial and civil should be separated from space domain awareness and national security space. I always rush to add the Defense Department's not going away. Nothing's changing. They're just going deeper on their mission and asking us to help pick up the slack on things that one might argue is not central to their concerns. So the decision was made to transfer this responsibility to the Department of Commerce. My office, the Office of Space Commerce, is the office within NOAA that will be executing this mission. Some of you know the Office of Space Commerce. It's a small office started in the 1980s, primarily as an advocacy office for commercial space. It also is the regulator for commercial remote sensing. We do trade promotion. We work with companies trying to get access to markets overseas. And as I said, we also work on the very important issue of standards, both in our office and through our colleagues at NIST. So we, as you all know, the Trump administration Space Council passed Space Policy Directive 3, which is now 4 years old, directing the Commerce Department to take over. My colleague, Kevin O'Connell, who I always point out because he did such a great job of taking this from 0 to 100 miles an hour. So my job has been very much easier by the tremendous work that Kevin accomplished while he was in the office. So SPD 3 says that the Department of Commerce will be the civil agency that is responsible for publicly releasable portion of the DoD catalog and for administrating an open architecture data repository. Under SPD 3, DoD retains responsibility for maintaining the authoritative catalog of objects and ensuring the release of data regarding national security activities to any person or entity with access to the repository, and making sure that access is consistent with national security interests. So the words are fairly broad. We're in the process now of trying to figure out what those words actually mean when you reduce them to practice. So a couple of weeks ago, we signed the memorandum of agreement between the Defense Department and the Commerce Department. And it set up a couple of working groups which will further define the roles and responsibilities, and it also will dig into details like ingesting data and maintaining the catalog. Obviously, we're not setting out to replicate what the DoD is doing, so we have a goal of trying to take maximum advantage of new technologies that exist. Many of those are commercial technologies and young companies. So I think the issue as we go forward is how do we keep what DoD is doing and what the Department of Commerce is doing in alignment, and that will be a central concern of the dialogue that we have with the department going forward. Already, we've started engaging with the commercial sector, and indeed, and a very robust engagement here at the conference. And I think the central message that we're getting from the commercial sector is, Richard, if all you're going to do is give us what we're already getting from the Defense Department, we think that's not enough. And so we're already getting a bunch of ideas of things that people think should be standard, requirements that operators share ephemeris data and maneuver plans, in case of high-risk collisions, the ability to request additional measurements to confirm orbit and probability of collision, allowing operators greater freedom to determine their own risk acceptance, specify the warning alert threshold in various consequences, handling, and of course, a big challenge these days, coming up with new ways to handle constantly maneuvering autonomous spacecraft. So we are charged with providing a basic service. The basic service assumes that there is an advanced service. So the idea being basic service is free from the US government, and that commercial companies can build on that to offer advanced services. In practice, it's that line is a little murky. and frankly, we are trying to stay on our side of the line. So we always ask when we meet with the commercial sector, what do you think an advanced service is? Do you think what you're doing is the advanced service? Because we don't want to compete with young companies. On the other hand, we do want to provide a forward-leaning, technologically superior product to what they're receiving today. So we've made some progress. We've only been at this less than 2 years, and we've made a little bit of progress. We're, of course, one of the big challenges is, which I'm sure all of you share, is it's people. You know, getting great people into the program has been a challenge. You know, being in the government, you're working by government hiring standards, which some days seem more onerous than necessary. So we're making some key hires to the program. We're growing our staff. I think we're supposed to hit 35 by next year. So that will be a welcome. And again, we're not just doing SSA. We're going to continue to do our regulatory responsibilities, our advocacy responsibilities. We have a policy team that works with the White House and internationally. So we have a lot of stuff going on. So that's still a pretty thin crew. We've demonstrated a prototype in collaboration with federal partners and commercial operators. We've initiated a sustained dialogue with industry to understand what new commercial technologies are available. Several weeks ago, we initiated the first of what will be a series of data buys. It's our expectation that we'll have a sustained need for fresh data as we go forward, and we'll soon be establishing some kind of contract vehicle to ensure the continued access to commercial data as we go forward. We'll also be initiating contract processes for buying other key commercially available technologies, data, and services. This fall, we're going to be working with the Joint Task Force Space Defense Commercial Operations Cell, or the JCO. We're going to be working with JCO to conduct an all-commercial pilot in GEO that will seek to replicate the DoD's basic service using only commercial data and analytics. So I think we're looking forward to that, and I have every expectation that pilot will be successful and will offer us a path forward towards an acquisition. We're engaging internationally and are collaborating. In particular, we're collaborating with our colleagues at the European Space Surveillance and Tracking Consortium, EUSST. I know that you're going to hear from Pascal Fauché in a little bit, but I think that relationship is the beginning of what will be a complicated web of international relationships. And I think it's great that we're starting with our European colleagues and understanding how to talk to each other, how to share data, and how to do a bunch of key things, because we're going to need to do it internationally. And of course, the biggest international problem is non-participation. So it's, we have an issue, as everyone here knows, with China, where they're just simply not sharing information, and we cannot safely operate in space if a major space participant isn't actively engaged in sharing information in a way that enhances safety for all. So we've reached out on many occasions and will continue to do so, but this is a global effort. We have to be able to work with people even if we disagree with them on other issues. So finally, there's this issue I always like to raise at the end, and it's a little, and I know the operators never want to hear this, but there isn't a necessary dialogue that we're going to have about operator responsibility. If you look at the arc of how we operate in GEO and the sophistication of geostationary operations and how that's changed over time, how we've moved to smaller spacing between satellites, the box that operators have to fly in, the ability to do constellations within individual boxes, the sophistication of our operations in GEO is an example of what we can accomplish when we're trying to maximize a scarce resource. Right now, I would say our operations in LEO are not at that same level, and we clearly need to develop new technologies and do new operational approaches for maximizing below Earth orbit. We have, as the government, I have to assume that we're going to have dozens of constellations operating in the future, and we have to have a plan for dealing with that. And right now, I'd have to say we don't. And part of that is going to be on the operators. In 2019, the FCC put out a very interesting document where they asked a lot of hard questions and asked whether they should be doing new rules on requirements for trackability and requirements for maneuver capabilities, information about the probability of human casualty resulting from uncontrolled atmospheric reentry, design reliability standards for large geo satellite constellations, satellite disposal reliability and methodology, appropriate deployment altitudes in LEO. And then they had a long, long list of things that they looked at, including at the end, should there be a requirement that operators indemnify the United States government against costs associated with claims brought against the government. Now, those were all very controversial. Ultimately, they didn't go forward on those things, and we could have a whole seminar on that dynamic. But I think the important point is to say that there are a lot of really tough questions that we need to ask going forward, and we need to work together to ask those questions. So we're not trying to burden the industry, but on the other hand, we are entering a much more complicated environment, and we need to have the rules that correspondingly help us make sure that it's safe, not for this generation, but for future generations. I think there's some really interesting technical issues. I think I'm personally fascinated with the idea of debris removal from space, remediation. And so I think one of the questions that always gets answered is that a technology that the government should be focused on? I know the Orbits Act, which just came out in draft from the Congress, suggests that NASA should be running a program on active debris removal. I think and I think the question is, can you really maintain large multi-thousand satellite constellations without active debris removal? Because you are going to have some mortality rate in your satellites. So I think, again, I don't want to frighten the commercial sector, but I just want to say there's a lot of hard discussions that we need to have. For our part, we're going to be doing our level best to try to come up with a modern SSA system that provides better information than the commercial sector is already getting, but there's a lot of other pieces of this puzzle that we also need to solve. I look forward to working with all of you and hearing your great ideas. It's been really exciting to meet the companies here and to hear what everyone's already working on. And I look forward to continuing that relationship. We have a lot of work to do on the government side too. You know, we have the dialogue with our defense departments just started, but so far it's been great. And I think, you know, what I suspect will probably happen is we'll need to stand up some capabilities and actually demonstrate over time that we can do things. I think that there was this idea that there was going to be this magical date when this transition happened, and please let me disabuse you of that notion. What is likely to happen is we'll stand up pieces of the capability, and when we're stable and when DoD feels like you know, we've got it, then they can step back a little bit. So it's going to be a gradual process. We're committed to doing this as rapidly as we possibly can, and with your help and assistance. I'd be glad to take some questions if anybody has questions.
So, thank you for that, Rich. And a reminder to the audience, if you do want to ask questions, please submit them through the app. We have a few here. Rich, I want to ask one of my own and pick up on the thread you mentioned about where we're going. Space Policy Directive 3 talked about the U.S. government building a space traffic management framework based on industry best practices and standards. Can you talk a little bit about how you might see that evolving over the next few years? There are several industry sets of practices out there. You know, how do you see that shaping into potential future rules and sort of standards discussions you just mentioned?
I think of it, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, personally, I think of this as a continuum. On one end, we have the very, very specific standards. And by that, I mean the things that the International Standards Organization works on. And these are sort of the building blocks of communication. What things must we agree on technically so that we can talk to each other and understand what each other is saying. I think as you move up the line, you get into what's called what I would call best practices. AIAA just released a report a couple weeks ago, and I think that was the product of Iridium, Starlink, OneWeb, and is somebody else, or is that the three of them came together to say what do we think best practices are? I know that NASA has done some great work. Laurie Newman and the CARA team have done some great work on manufacturing for debris removal and other things. Not debris removal, but debris mitigation. So I think there are a lot of instructive best practices that have been articulated, and hopefully the industry will stay engaged and the associations will stay engaged in producing those. And then as we go further out of the spectrum, we get into the international realm with rules of the road, where nations can agree, either formally or informally, that there are certain rules. And I think there's a lot of room there. I mean, it doesn't have to be written into a treaty. That I think the Artemis Accords, which NASA has so successfully introduced, is an interesting example of how multilaterally space-capable nations can come to agreement on some important principles. So I think I see it as a spectrum where we're trying to where we are trying to get coherence on how we operate, but there are a lot of different levels that happens.
So there are a few questions here about your plans for acquiring data. Two of them I'm going to combine together. One is whether the Commerce Department envisions developing their own sensor capabilities or pulling from other sources, commercial, DoD, maybe others. And then sort of related to that, there's a question of whether contracts for commercial data will be purchases from both Commerce and DoD. In other words, would you be doing separate contracts with commercial companies separate or in addition to what the DoD is doing?
It's all, again, we are at the beginning of our dialogue with DoD, so I don't want to be categorical about this. My assumption is that we'll be completely separate. And that we'll probably, my current thinking is that we'll probably set something up like an IDIQ where we have sort of an evergreen source of data. One of the things, again, that operators routinely ask for is the ability to do relooks. So we may have separate taskings in that contract that would empower the ability to go in and do focused relook at various targets. Again, in terms of sharing with DoD, we are certainly open to it. We haven't worked on that piece yet. But I'm assuming that we will have access to the SSN, and we'll also have access to an awful lot of commercial data that'll be coming in under contracts that we put in place.
And do you envision Department of Commerce operating its own sensors, or?
No. Okay. No, I don't. Again, I think that we, unlike the Weather Service that operates its own satellites, and that we're not going to replicate that model. We don't see any reason that we should have to own we're going to own the platform, the cloud infrastructure, we're going to own the delivery mechanism and ultimately the responsibility. But within that, it's largely going to be commercial components.
So could you provide some more detail about the pilot program you mentioned, the all commercial? Are you buying commercial data, just observational data? Is there going to be different kinds of analytical products involved? Can you talk a little bit more about what that might involve?
We've reached out to my old colleagues at the Space Data Association and asked them if they wanted to work together. And so we're in the process of that dialogue, but they've suggested they may be able to bring a couple hundred satellites that we could target. We're going to do it just at GEO because, quite frankly, that's easier. And so we have a couple hundred satellites. The JCO has what they call the marketplace, where a bunch of there's a bunch of contractors who are already in the marketplace, both data providers and analytical and software companies. And so what we would do is try to set up a situation where we're actually doing the active tracking and a conjunction assessment over some period of time, 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, something like that, and then looking at the data and comparing it to how would we have done if we were on the SSN and using the 18th processes. So it's a fairly simplistic demo. It's designed to exercise our team as much as it's designed to exercise the commercial capabilities. And it's designed to get us talking to real operators, and it's designed to allow commercial providers to sort of shine a little bit and show their wares.
You mentioned this discussion, I mean, what is the free basic service, what are the advanced services? Do you anticipate at some point publishing a formal definition of what that might look like, what the free basic service would be? And I'm almost, as I said, I'm thinking almost like sort of the GPS world, right? There's a defining document of what is in there and how it looks like, and that is sort of everyone can reference. Would ever be something like that, or do you think it's going to be a little bit fluid for a while of what that?
I think it's going to be a little bit fluid for a while. I mean, the natural tendency on our team is going to want to get better, right? So we are going to want to do better. And the question is, when does doing better start interfering with somebody else's valid business plan? So we're, again, the one thing in all of our meetings, the one thing we always ask commercial operators is, where do you think that line is? So we're very interested in hearing from the commercial sector where they think the line is. But if you look at the totality of services that are both currently offered and things that people have created as desires, I mean, you have to acknowledge the different desires of the different participants. Operators would like everything free, right? I mean, that's like a basic principle. I want this stuff for free. And commercial providers would like to get paid. So we're kind of in the middle of that dialogue. So
you talked about the process the FCC ran a few years ago on asking questions about the future of dream mitigation. They just released they just approved a new rule requiring a 5-year deorbit for objects or constellations that end up in LEO. But there's also been this ongoing discussion about whether the FCC is the right place to do that and sort of future responsibilities for the Department of Commerce. So is that still where you see the vision that eventually you think that the Department of Commerce should have this broader authority for, oversight of what's going on in space? Or do you see that still kind of being distributed among multiple agencies?
I think it's good to take a step back and ask, how is this done internationally? In most countries, somebody has a broad grant of authority to manage space. And they tend, and in most countries, that either a space agency or a space regulator is responsible for everything. In the United States, the way we've done this in collaboration with our colleagues in the United States Congress is that there are specific grants of authority. For example, I do commercial remote sensing, but because of the way the law is written, I can't do something like Hawkeye 360. I can't do RF monitoring of the Earth because our lawyers determined that that's outside the scope of the legislation. I think the FCC, for their part, has pushed the boundaries of their authorities pretty aggressively. And I think that and I know that our colleagues in the National Space Council are looking at this specifically, this issue of where are there gaps, regulatory gaps, in the United States, and how do we fill those gaps? I think a lot of the things that the FCC articulated, although I certainly congratulate them on the depth of their intellectual work, a lot of the things they articulated are probably, arguably, outside their job jar. And so how we implement those going forward, whether that's Department of Commerce or the likely agencies are either Department of Commerce or Department of Transportation. And I think what the White House is looking at now is how do we best do that? And I think Diane Howard, who is here, is responsible for that work, and they've been meeting on this regularly. So I hope we'll probably see something by the end of the year providing direction on this. But again, you know, we will do what we can in the administration. Ultimately, there will be a dialogue with the U.S. Congress, and we'll see where this ultimately ends up.
All right. Thank you very much, Rich.
Thank you. Great day.